Hello and welcome back. This video is part of a Health 360 series meant as a demo for the weight and fitness dashboards. First, let's talk about the weight dashboard. The weight dashboard is fully automated, displaying insightful graphs and metrics. This dashboard consists of three sections. First, an overview of your parameters, here on the left. Then a summary of your progress, here in the middle section. And then a third section containing the weekly values and trends, here at the end. First, let's go over the overview section on the left. You will see that first you have a report date. This date is a cutoff for your dashboard, indicating what is the latest date that will be used to assess your performance, starting from the start date in your journal, as you have defined it, all the way to this report date. Report date will be the same as highlight date from your journal. Since highlight date is said to be reflective of today's date, your dashboard will always be up to date, and you will need to change your report date. If you delete highlight date, your dashboard will be set to today's date automatically. In case you have data in your journal filled out for the dates beyond your report date, your dashboard will not show it, and the corresponding weeks that are past that date will be grayed out and considered out of scope. Next, you will view a summary of your settings, displaying your set dates, units, height, as well as the goal and starting weight values. The start and end date are pulled directly from your journal, and the duration is calculated based on those two. You can see that all these cells have a color background, so you should not modify them. Units is pulled from your customization, as well as height, and then your goal and starting point are based on what you define for the metric section in your journal. You will then find a helpful BMI reference table for you to review your starting, current, and goal values. To do this, simply choose the values from the dropdown for starting, current, as well as goal values. Lastly, you can also see a summary of your objective as well as the recommended or standard healthy weight gain or loss reference to compare against your goal and evaluate how aggressive or conservative it is. In this case, since my start is 216 and my goal is 172, I have set the goal of losing 44 pounds. And since my duration is 53 weeks based on the dates that I have entered, this translates to an average of 0.8 pounds per week. Let's now cover the second section. This section displays a summary of your progress. This first row implements a checkbox for you to select between average or end of week values. This selection will affect the values used both in your summary as well as your weekly breakdown. Right now, the label indicates that I'm using weekly average values. If I click the checkbox, then this means that I'm using end of week values. If you enter more than one value each week in your journal, then all those values will be averaged out in case the checkbox is activated. This is what it's shown here right now. In case you want to see the end of the week values, you can uncheck the checkbox, and this will show only the values that lie at the last day of the week based on your defined dates, in this case, Sundays. If you want to track your weight only once per week, but not necessarily by the end of the week, then you can leave this checkbox active, and it will show only the average of one value, which is essentially the weighing value that you selected. Next up, you will see a summary of your current weight and BMI values. For each one of these two, you will see current value, the goal, and then the progress. That is the current value compared against the start. You also have an arrow indicating your trend. The coloring will be based out on your objective. In this case, since I decided to lose weight and my progress has been towards my goal, the arrow shows a downward trend and it's colored green. The same applies for the BMI values. You can see there's a linear relationship between these two. So whatever progress I have achieved in one of them, it will show on the other. Next, you have a time series graph of your weight progress. This is displaying the weekly values, either averages or specific values based on your selection in the checkbox, and you will be able to keep an eye on your performance, the trend, and the distance to goal. Notice that the horizontal dashed line is a reference of your goal, here at 172 in my case. There's also a dotted line that is a linear trend of my progress. And then you also have the actual values in the darker line, showing one value for each of the weeks. Again, either average or the end of the week. Finally, you have two visual indicators, one for your weight objective and the other one for your time frame. These indicators display the remaining distance to your goal as well as the remaining time for you to achieve it. Obviously, this assumes that you want to achieve your goal by the end of the journal date. In this example, I have lost 38.2 pounds, which means that I am 87% there. And the remaining space that you see here is the equivalent of 13% or 5.8 pounds. And in terms of time, right now, based on the report date, which is September 24th, it means that I'm on week 39. So 268 days have been elapsed, or 73% of the time, and therefore 14 weeks, or 98 days, are remaining, which is equivalent of 27% of my duration. Lastly, the third section, the weekly values and trends, displays a weekly breakdown of your values as well as an evaluation of your changes. The first columns show the weeks and dates from your journal, displaying up to 53 weeks total and showing the number of the week, the start and the end date, as well as the total number of days. Notice now two things. Dates that are beyond your report date or current date will be grayed out. And the second thing is that for the current week, in this case 39, the number of days will be updated based on the current date. So right now, September 24th is just the second day of the week. So it shows 2 days. As time progresses, this week will be completed, and then the number of days shown will go up to 7. So this value goes from 1 to 7, depending on the start and end dates. Now, for each week, the table will show your average or end of week values based on your selection. For your weight, obviously, in the units that you have specified. Right now, I have selected weekly average, so that's what the values are. But if I change the selection, notice that not only the values but also the headers will change. So right now, I'm using end of week values instead of the weekly average. Let's leave it in weekly average. And then finally, the last two columns compare the changes against the start as well as against the prior week. So let's see these more in detail. The first one, change against start, will always compare the value that you have in this column against the starting point, in my case, the 216 pounds. So, in this case, 210 pounds as my weekly average for week 4 means that against the 216 is negative 6 pounds in change, or equivalently, negative 2.8%. Since my goal is to lose weight, then this will be colored in green, and it shows a downward trend, since I'm now at a lower level than my starting point. Similarly, for this example, let's look at week 5. Week 5 now has 216.5 pounds, which means I have increased the weight by 0.5 pounds against the start, which is an equivalent of plus 0.2%. And then, since now my trend is upward and is against my goal, it's colored in yellow. The exact same logic happens in the change against prior week values. But now in this case, it's not comparing against the 216, but rather the value that precedes the week that I'm analyzing. Let's look at this case. For example, 210.6 is compared against 218. So in this case, the difference between these two is negative 7.4 pounds, or negative 3.4%. Since this is, again, in the direction that I want to move, because I indicated that the goal was to lose, then the downward trend is now appearing in green. Obviously, week 1 will always be empty because there is no prior week. One last thing that I wanted to point out for this dashboard. You can see that your time series graph has an axis indicating the units on the left. You can change these values, either the mean or the max, by clicking on the numbers, right-clicking on it, and then going to Format Axis. As I said, you can change minimum and maximum values. Excel doesn't always do a good job auto-scaling this graph, which causes sometimes that important variations are hidden. For example, on my graph, you can see that almost half of it, or even more, is not showing any values because it starts at 0, then my goal is 172, and then the maximum is 250. But what happens if my minimum is set to say 150? Now you can see I can see more variations. You can always reset any changes that you have made by clicking on the reset buttons here on the right. If you see the legend auto appearing, it means that Excel has automatically decided what values to set. You can also personalize this even more by going to the tick marks, labels, or even the number sections, but let's not cover that in this video. Now let's talk about the second, the fitness dashboard. This worksheet is very similar to other dashboards appearing in the Health 360 series. There are two logical sections in the worksheet. First, there's a date section on the left-hand side, here, columns B to G. This section shows your start and end date from your journal, as well as the report date, which has the exact same logic as the one we reviewed for weight. So as a reminder, the report date will be either the date you have specified on the highlighted field of your journal, or it will show today's date by default. Next up, you have two additional date parameters, the from date and the to date. These parameters will help you zoom in or zoom out for your time series graphs. From date will let you set the starting point of the graph, and to date will let you set the ending point for the graph. You will then find two checkboxes. The first one allows you to select either weekly averages or end of week values, much like the weight dashboard. And then the second one will allow you to switch from the comparison against the start or the previous week for each of the metrics, since the tables only have one space, comparing either against the start or the previous week. So for example, if I uncheck this, you can see that it now says change against prior week, and week 1 is empty. And then for the first checkbox, I now have end of week values instead of weekly averages. And you could see that now the graphs changed when I selected that checkbox. Let's unselect them or select them again. And then lastly, below these checkboxes, you have a weekly table. This table shows the start and end date as well as the number of days in each of the weeks, similar to the table with the weekly breakdown for the weight. For the elapsed weeks, you will see that they appear in black, while any week that is past your report date will be grayed out. Again, the number of days for the active week will depend on the report date. The other section corresponds to the fitness metrics section. You can visualize up to 5 metrics at once by using each of the 5 blocks in the metrics section of the dashboard. The only thing you need to do is to select any of your defined metrics directly by using the dropdown provided. Once you do that, the dashboard will update automatically. So let's see, if I delete these, it's completely empty and nothing's showing. But then if I select waste again, then it's updated. You can change a selected metric anytime, for example, if you want to display a different set of metrics. And notice that you cannot add any additional blocks. Copying and pasting a block will not work because there are hidden references that will not be carried over. One last thing, as part of the fitness metrics, you will also be able to select your weight as the first option. And you can always change the values for the y-axis in case you want that to happen as well, following the same procedure that we saw for the weight dashboard. Let's now take a closer look at this first block to see the functionalities implemented. There are 6 automated fields in each of the blocks. First, you have the name of the metric that you have selected. If no metric selected, as we saw earlier, then the label no metric selected will appear. Then you have the summary metrics with the start and goal values. These are carried over from your journal based on your definitions. The third thing you will see is a weekly time series graph of the metric, here in this area. This time series will display either weekly average or end of week values for each metric depending on your selection. Notice that this selection is independent from the weight dashboard. The values on the graph will also obey the from date and to date selections that you make. For example, let's say that I want to focus on only March. So I select March 1st, 2024. and then I select March 31st, 2024. Now you can see that I only have weeks 9 all the way to 13 because those are the weeks that correspond to March. As you can see, everything else is grayed out. And now the values are the averages of those weeks. This will exclude, for example, all the days in February, and will only include March 1st onwards. And then the last week goes all the way to March 31st, so there's no issue on that one. When I select end of week values, you can see that the label now says end of week values, and now it's not an average, it's simply the values that I selected in my journal for that last day of the week. As I toggle between these two, you can see that the graph, as well as the value showing here, change because I am selecting between average or the actual value for one day. And then lastly, if I switch between comparing against the start or comparing against prior week, you can also see there's a change. The same logic applies as in the weight. So in this case, I'm comparing the 37.2 against the start, the 40. And since I wanted to lose, in this case, inches in my waist, the downward trend is assessed as positive, so it's green. And then the values of negative 2.8 and negative 7.1% appear, comparing the 40 against the 37.2. If I do against the prior week, I can see now that the 37.2 is compared against the 40.3. So in this case, the gap increases a little bit, so the absolute difference is higher, or in this case, more negative. The percentage also changes, but now the trend still is downwards, so that's a good thing. You can see that the trend changes if I go to week 10, because it now has increased against week 9. If I switch the comparison for the start, it's still green because it's lower than my beginning value. But then when I compare it against the prior week, it's now gone upward, so now the status is yellow. By default, the from date will be set to the starting date of your journal, and then the to date will be set to your report date. The only thing you need to remember is that the from date must be greater than or equal to the start date and less than or equal to the end date, and the to date must be greater than or equal to from date and must also be less than or equal to the end date of your journal. Lastly, you also have a weekly breakdown that we already went over. So you have the week number, then the week average or end of week value, and then the change against either the start or the prior week. Now to close this section, let's just go through a few additional notes and reminders. The start and end dates are pulled directly from your journal, so do not manually modify them in your dashboards. Report date will be the same as highlight date in your journal, or in case it's empty, it will show today's date. I will advise you not to change the value of the report date directly in the field of the dashboard, as it may cause errors in the functionality. In case you have data in your journal that it's filled out for dates that are beyond your report date displayed, your dashboard will not show or use any of it, and the corresponding weeks past that date will be grayed out accordingly. This concludes the demonstration of the weight and fitness dashboards. See you in the next video to continue our tour.